Very good. Our live stream is active, so we will begin our events. Welcome everyone to the reviews of the Enoch Seminar virtual book review session. My name is Dr. Joshua Scott. I'm the chief editor of the RES. We are very pleased to welcome you to this virtual review where we will discuss Dr. Archie Wright's new book, Saint and the Problem of Evil, from the Bible to the Early Church Fathers. RES is a digital review service of the Enoch Seminar that publishes quarterly reviews of recent books. In service for over 11 years, the Review Journal distributes high-quality reviews that target works significant to our field of research, including works on the Hebrew Bible, pseudepigrapha, apocrypha, Qumran scrolls, as well as Christian, rabbinic, and Islamic literature. If you have recently published a book and would like us to consider it for review, or are interested in writing reviews, please contact me by email, and I'll drop my email in the chat in a moment. This review is our first review of the 2023 season. We have 4 reviews scheduled for 2023, each quarter, and so we invite you to stay connected to RES through the Enoch Seminar webpage and Facebook page. We invite today's participants to become members of the Enoch Seminar. Members receive special invitations to our events, quarterly emailings from our leadership, the ability to participate as a speaker at our events, and reduced meeting fees. And you're able to list the Enoch Seminar officially on your CV. In addition, starting in early summer, we will begin highlighting our members' research in a new member highlight portion of our monthly newsletter. More information about Enoch Seminar membership is available on our websites. And I'll post that in the chat in a moment. I'm pleased to chair today's session. The review session will begin with a brief overview by Archie Wright of his book. We will then hear reviews from Dr. Anna Angelini and Hannah Fonseca Bakar. To focus our time on the book, we will only offer very brief introductions to today's speakers. We encourage all participants to engage the conversation through Zoom's chat function. Once we move to open discussion, we will also invite participants to use the raised hand feature if they would like to join us on screen to engage the speakers directly. With those announcements, we're pleased now to begin with a brief introduction to the book by Dr. Archie Wright, Executive Director of the Catholic Biblical Association of America. Archie, the floor is yours.
All right. I first want to thank Gabriella and Joshua, and of course the Enoch Seminar for putting on this event. I'm really looking forward to it. Also want to thank Anna and Hannah for their participation and taking the time out of their schedules to review this book for this event. Well, we were going to have another reviewer, Ben Wold, who's a good friend of mine. I'm very sorry he's not here, but he is tackling his own problem of evil with events of administration nature. So sorry, Ben can't be here. So I just want to briefly just kind of summarize why I wrote this book and highlight some of the parts in it that I feel are important to the discussion. I was inspired to write this book by what I saw as the many misconceptions of the Satan or the devil in the world, and particularly in the church. The prevalent view suggests that this figure is on the same spiritual plane as God and about as equally powerful and omnipresent. However, based on the biblical and extra-biblical texts that I examined in the volume, this is certainly not the case. In examining these texts from the Jewish scriptures, the Second Temple period Jewish literature, and the New Testament, it is clear there is a diversity of opinions concerning the Satan figure, which should be no surprise due to the diversity of Judaism in the Second Temple period. As a result, there are sects within Judaism who saw personified evil in various figures, whether it be the Satan, the devil, Beliar or Belial, or Melchirishah, and even multiple Satans, while others understood the terms, such as Beliar, were speaking of a spirit of wickedness within people. These texts reveal that the developing discourse about the figure was not simply theoretical. These authors attempted to come to terms with evil and the human experience. Such questions as why did discourses on evil lead to the personification of evil in the figures discussed in this volume? Or why does there need to be an evil subordinate or an evil equal to God? Are important questions, but at the same time, others were asking, why did some cultures express evil in principal terms rather than personified evil? I attempt to show that answers to the origins of evil and the Satan/devil idea today emerge in the period of the early church, and in particular the writings of the early church fathers, in which we see a shift in the figure from the one who has been, for the most part, operating under the sovereignty and authority of God in Jewish scriptures, Second Temple period Jewish literature, and the New Testament, to one who is somewhat autonomous and the enemy of God. My research has revealed that if he is the enemy of anything, he is the enemy of humanity. The texts tell us that the Satan figure hates humanity and believes we are totally corrupt and evil and deserve to be destroyed. But the great deception has been that he is at war with God rather than working for God. Why did this shift take place? The writings of the early church fathers reveal that the ongoing conflict between the various Gnostic groups and the church leadership resulted in the leadership identifying the Satan figure through their reading of scripture with many of the monikers that the church today think describe his nature and function in order to counter the teachings of the Gnostics. This resulted in the Satan figure being granted power that he did not possess, nor was it God's intention for him to obtain. For many today, the very idea of believing in or conceptualizing a Satan figure constitutes unnecessary baggage from the distant past. Humanity, whether then or now, knows all too well the problems posed by natural disasters, such as we see in Turkey and Syria today, that result in the sufferings of all kinds. Repressive impositions of social order that we see in Afghanistan, wars such as we see in Ukraine, individual acts of wrongdoing, the activity that undermines human dignity, such as human trafficking, are the real evils that are at work in our society. The question is, are there spiritual forces behind these evils? My hope is that this book will open the eyes of humanity to see the problem of evil is not to be laid at the feet of this Satan figure, but rather the primary responsibility for evil lies at the feet of humanity and our poor choices and our hunger for power. In summary, as has been seen throughout the history of human race, beginning with the myth of Adam and Eve, the story of the fallen watchers in 1 Enoch, Judas in the Gospels, and the numerous evil figures in human history, evil is a choice of one's will, whether it is a human or divine being, like the Watcher Angels. It is clear from the literature that the Satan figure or figures performed a function on the earth, the testing of individuals and nations as to their faithfulness to God, including Jesus. But this testing was conducted under the authority and the sovereignty of the God of Israel. Failure to pass the test resulted in pain and suffering, and sometimes to the point of death or exile. Evil is something that is initiated by one's choices and decisions, which are our own responsibility. This view is part of the ever-present two ways philosophy that has been found in the theological literature of humanity since the beginning. The path of evil and good exists in the cosmos, and our decisions or choices are in part being influenced by spiritual forces on the earth, good and evil, which is present in the literature that I examined. However, if the evil is ever present, from where did the evil originate? Did it come from God? Did it originate in the work of the demiurge, as the Gnostics would have us believe? Or is it simply part of human nature or the human psyche? Humanity has always been searching for an answer to the problem of evil, usually always beyond or outside of itself. There must be a cause for the evil we see. This is true. But is it an external force, or is the real cause within ourselves? The early theologians had to blame something for the evil in the world they lived in. For the Gnostics, it was the demiurge. For the church fathers, the Satan or the devil figure. In the case of the sin of Adam, it is the serpent. And in the end, the Satan figure. But what if the tree in the garden was only a test of Adam and Eve's faithfulness? What if the trial of Jesus in the wilderness was just a test of his willingness to be Messiah? Both were allegedly conducted by the same heavenly figure, the Satan. But while one test was a failure that allegedly caused the suffering of humanity and the unleashing of evil in the world, the other was a success that we hope is bringing about the end of that evil. So I close with this hopeful quote from Anne Frank, which I ended the book with. Quote, "How wonderful it is that nobody need wait a single moment before starting to improve the world." Unquote. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Archie, for that introduction. We now welcome Dr. Anna Angelini from the University of Zurich. Anna, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
So first, I wish to thank the author, to thank Joshua and the team of the Enoch Seminar for involving me in this panel on such an interesting topic. And I also wish to start by congratulating Archie for the very impressive amount of evidence that you attentively scrutinized in this book, and for having engaged in such a wide work which goes across several periods and compare many different sources in such a systematic way. In this regard, the book fills indeed a gap in scholarship, at least to the best of my knowledge. This reading has elicited several comments and questions, which I must, however, say that will be mostly limited to my area of expertise, Hebrew Bible, Septuagint, and literature for the Second Temple period, from the Second Temple period. But I hope they will still stimulate our discussion. My remarks address mainly three topics. First, the early stages of the literary and historical development of the Satan as a figure. Second, the relationship between Satan and other evil powers and heavenly powers more general. And third, the issue of the foreign influences on the early development of the what you call the figures for evil. So as for the first point, and as an overall appreciation, I believe that this book engages in an important and welcome enterprise, which I would define as an enterprise of disentanglement. By this, I mean that the book achieves the goal of differentiating between various figures of evil, which are sometimes too quickly superposed by scholarship. In this regard, one of the most interesting points on which you draw attention is the multiplication of such figures for evil in the literature of the Second Temple period, in what you call the other names of Satan, rightly with a question mark. I think Stema, Belial, Beliar, the angel of darkness, and others as well, which interestingly are left aside by New Testament authors who instead return back to the biblical Satan and devil, Diabolos. But at the same time, you also show the longue durée trajectories by which some of these figures, whose traits are often not clearly individualized, came to overlap, at least to an extent, and analyze this major shift that the Satan figure underwent, which led him to acquire such a prominent role in early Christian traditions. In this regard, and in what concerned the Hebrew Bible more specifically, I found very helpful the inclusion in the discussion of so-called side episodes, so to speak, such as certainly Genesis 3, but also Isaiah 14, Ezekiel 28, Job 4, which has been put in relationship with Satan or the devil in an ancient stage of the history of interpretation, but were not connected with this theme in their original context of production. And along this line, I wonder if we couldn't and shouldn't go a bit further in doing such a work of differentiation and reflecting a bit on the equivalence between the Hebrew Satan and the Greek Diabolos. which does not go by itself. In fact, while diabolos can simply mean enemy or adversary in Greek, as it derives from diaballo, put through, it means also slender, especially in judicial context. Therefore, this translation choice provides a pejorative connotation that was absent or maybe implicit in the Hebrew text. Hence, this might represent a first step towards, so to speak, the future career of Satan. And in this regard, it is significant that the rendering diabolos is not unanimously employed by the translator, but is chosen in those instances for which for a reason or another, they want to stress a connotate reading, such as Zechariah 3 or the book of Job, where the underlying idea might be that the accusation brought against Zechariah and Job were in fact unfounded. In this way, the Greek text displays a stronger contrast between the angel of the Lord and the Satan, at least in Zechariah 3, I think. And by contrary, in the occurrences where the differentiation between Satan and the angel of Yahweh is less clear in the Hebrew text, such as number 22nd, as you see, as you explain, the Satan disappears from the Greek translation, which renders with the verb diabalein, here with the meaning, I believe, to put himself through. So I think we could perhaps make a better place for the Septuagint, which already evinces some interesting differences in comparison with the Hebrew Bible, while we reconstruct the early career of Satan. And this is also relatively unsurprising, as the Septuagint is technically contemporaneous with Second Temple literature, so it's somehow natural that we expect some changes to be put into place. My second set of remarks concern the relationship between Satan and the other heavenly power more broadly you discuss in the book. A central point you make, which also corresponds, if I understood well, to one of your guideline questions, is the distinction between Satan as a name, as a title, as a function, and the related issue of the personification of evil. This distinction is essential in what concerns the Old Testament, I believe, as must be put in relationship with the major system of representation of gods in West Semitic pantheons, which is the heavenly court, with a major god or a divine couple on the top and several roles distributed along the lower levels. And I perfectly agree that Satan in the Hebrew Bible represents a function within the heavenly court, be it the function of a juridical adversary, as it seems clear in Zechariah 3, or when he acts as a sort of special agent or overseer, as it says in Job and in 1 Chronicles. As you mentioned again, number 22, where the angel of the Lord acts as a Satan, is an excellent example of the functional nature of Satan in the Hebrew Bible. However, when moving to the evidence from Second Temple period, things become more blurred. It seems that we cannot always establish a perfect correspondence between presence, absence of the article, determinative article, and presence of our absence of personification. As you observe, in some instances in your survey, ho diabolos seems still to indicate a title rather than a proper name. And on this issue, perhaps some elements might be helpful to think things further. First, although Satan in the Hebrew Bible acts at the dependence of Yahweh, there are already elements in the Hebrew Bible itself, I believe, which underlie his special status within the heavenly court. For example, during the divine assembly described in Job, it is said that the Bnei Elohim were united and that also Satan, Gam Satan, came at that time, which may imply that he was not always there. Moreover, in the book of Job, Satan takes greater liberties than any other spirit in the divine assembly scenes in the Hebrew Bible. So I think we see already its potential somehow in noce, so to speak, when compared to other spirits and demonic entities. And In this regard, I also think that the solution to the issue whether or not Satan functions as a demonic figure in the Hebrew Bible and Dead Sea Scrolls depends ultimately on how we define a demon. We are used to think of demons basically as being opposed to gods or to God, but this might be already a Judeo-Christian heritage. While putting ourselves in an ancient perspective, we might also consider that demons can be at the service of greater gods. Especially in Mesopotamia, they are often represented this way. So distinguishing between a god and a demon is often a matter of delimiting the extent and the domains of power more than a contrast between good and bad. In this regard, we might understand better the significance of this flourishing of figures for evil in the Second Temple period if we inscribe this process within a broader change in the representation of the demonic sphere, which took place, I believe, in this period. Hence, if we consider the spatial status of Satan arrayed in the Hebrew Bible, the transformations occurred in the Septuagint, and the reconfiguration of the religious category of demons in the Second Temple times, then this implies, in my view, some modifications in the overall history of Satan you reconstruct. Without denying the major ideological shift brought by early Christian fathers in the representation of this evil power, I wonder if we shouldn't better appreciate such a trajectory in all its complexity as being made of both continuities and discontinuities, rather than focusing only on one major shift or one major break. And also, a last point, always talking about the distinction between titles and personal names, you raise the question why the term devil, diabolos, is not identified as a personal name the same way Satan is. And I would suggest tentatively that the response to why diabolos remains a title and Satan a proper name might lie in the respective semantics of both terms in Greek. Diabolos is a transparent word in that it describes a function, be that the one of accuser or slander. While Satan originally in Hebrew described the function as well, once it passed into Greek, the term might not have been meaningful anymore or transparent anymore for the ancient audience. In this regard, the Septuagint proves again a relevant witness, as some translators preferred to transliterate Satan, Satanas, while others went for diabolos. And the question becomes then what the translator thought when they choose one option or another. According to Emmanuel Tov, transliterations are employed by Septuagint translators only in case of either unknown words or proper names. And here might be difficult to choose. The Greek form Satan could reflect understanding as a proper name, but I think more probably it also could reflect the willingness to retain a juridical function for which there was no perfect equivalent in Greek. Whatever the ultimate rationale for the translators might have been, it seems, however, that once it passed into Greek, this form was somehow frozen and becomes more opaque in comparison with diabolos, the enemy, the slander. And this might have facilitated the understanding of Satan as a proper name. My final comments, which is like framed more as a question, concern the role of the foreign influences on the development of this personification of evil. As for the earlier stages, you collected evidence from Persia, Mesopotamia, Greece, West Semitic area, Egypt as well. As you said, we can observe some parallels, but there is no documentable direct influence. My guess is that broad similarities here simply attest to the fact that ancient religions, as the modern ones, were sensitive to the problem of the origin of evil, which they solved in different ways. Different from us, but also with differences among themselves due to cultural specificities. In the case of the Israelite religion in the Second Temple period, however, and the possible derivation of dualistic cosmology from Zoroastrian conception, the situation is partly different because Persian influence are better documented for this period. However, would you consider also the possibility that also inner factors might have triggered such influences? I'm thinking here to the development of the self, which might have impacted the approach to the overall problem of evil, and showed, for example, by studies of Carol Newsom, Indy Nyman, and others as well. And with this last question, I thank you again for providing for all of us so much food for thought. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. We appreciate your comments. We'll now turn to Hannah Faseka Bakar, PhD candidate at McMaster University. Hannah, the floor is yours.
I'd like to begin by thanking Joshua and the Enoch Seminar for inviting me to present at this event. And a big thank you to Archie as well for writing such an exhaustive, interesting, comprehensive survey on the problem of evil and the figure of the Satan. I quickly just want to mention that my review possesses the bias of my own work and interests, which are female demons in pseudepigraphic literature, alongside the role of gender in demons and other demonic entities, as they are found in the Hebrew Bible, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and in pseudepigraphic texts. The logical problem of evil, which is a conflict between the claims of theism and the facts about evil and suffering in our world, has generated various responses from a wide variety of people throughout our history. And not only have theists been interested in this profound question, but secularists too. There's Peter Keavy, who argues that even if one does not believe in a deity, there is still a secular problem of evil that arises from the issue of reconciling human harm caused by others. According to Keavy, all but the most morally doubtful individuals agree that humans should not intentionally cause harm to others. And this creates a secular problem of evil when someone causes injury to another person with no apparent logical reason or justifiable benefit. Voltaire, on the other hand, explained that evil is necessary for the common good of the social process. David Hume concluded instead that human beings project their own subjective disapprovals onto events and actions and thus deny the existence of the problem in the first place. There is really no lack of theistic approaches to this problem of evil. And although there are likely many more categories, John Hick, for example, explained that there are three main theistic responses to this problem. One is the common free will theodicy, the other is the soul-making theodicy, and finally the newer process theology, all of which assume that evil is an unfortunate result of human free will. In other words, there are likely responses for every kind of perspective. What Archie Wright does in this book that we have gathered here today to discuss is interweave the figures of Satan, God, with the problem of evil in order to explain through what I understood as 5 different categories of how Satan was perceived in each one of them. The categories being the Hebrew Bible and Septuagint, the Dead Sea Scrolls, Second Temple Pseudepigrapha, the New Testament, and the early church period. In discussing Satan and the devil in the Hebrew Bible and the Septuagint, Wright explains that both the terms Satan and devil are understood as one who persecutes, opposes, or acts as an adversary. That is his quote. Therefore, and again a quote from Wright, a plausible conclusion from this examination suggests that within the worldview of the Israelites in pre-exilic and post-exilic biblical texts, there is no Satan figure similar to that which is portrayed as an autonomous or semi-autonomous figure as found in the later Christian tradition, end of quote. Similarly can be said of the figure of the Satan in the Dead Sea Scrolls, according to Archie in his chapter about Satan in the Dead Sea Scrolls. However, due to the fragmentary nature of the scrolls, Wright explains that it is difficult to make a final determination. Nonetheless, he does deduce that the term Satan, and this is a quote again, suggests a figure acting as an adversary that may or may not be operating under the authority of God, end of quote. When looking at the figure of Satan in the Second Temple period pseudepigrapha and in other such Jewish writings, the concept of Satan or devil became fluid in that it appears to be an entity, a noun, as Anna was also highlighting, rather than a proper name, whose task is to test and deceive humanity, but can only do so under the authority of God, thus functioning in a similar way to the book of Job. The problem of evil comes once again to the forefront, predominantly so when discussing Satan in the New Testament. This figure can be highly appreciated in the Gospels, the Epistles, and in Revelation. In these texts, the Satan figure seems to have a number of roles like leader, chief over a group of evil spirits, accuser of humanity, one who tests the faiths of individuals, and other tasks of that kind. In the New Testament literature, Wright explains that the term Satan is not necessarily identified as the same figure each time, and the author saw the spirits at work behind a variety of groups that were in opposition to God's plan. And finally, in the early church period, finally for the last part of the categories, the Satan figure is understood through the doctrines established by Augustine, which proclaims that God is not the cause of evil in the world. This understanding is held in tension with Amos 3:7, which says that if there is a calamity, then it is the result of the Lord's doing. Nonetheless, what Archie explains is that the philosophical views of Augustine were the primary source of understanding in that time period. So from the test of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, as Archie was also highlighting in the beginning in his introduction, to the trial of Jesus in the wilderness, the Satan figure has been a primary subject that has said to either bring suffering to the world or bring about God's will, culminating with a beautiful Anne Frank quote that I was going to read, but Archie already shared with us. Wright ends his survey of the Satan figure across religious literary history. Likely because it is focused on the figure of the Satan, Wright does not necessarily provide details on the Satan's or the devil's varying army of demons. In his section on Satan's other names, Wright does discuss a few demons that serve Beliar and Mastema, yet this exploration of demons is quite limited. Additionally, it would have been beneficial to have a more in-depth examination of gender within the book's content. I can't help but connect my own work on female demons. Studying gender in literature, I believe, is important because gender influences the interpretation and representation of literary characters. So by examining the ways in which gender affects character development, plot, and themes, we can gain a deeper understanding of the role that gender plays in shaping our narratives and beliefs. This is particularly relevant in the case of female demons, where the portrayal of gender can shape how the characters are perceived and how they challenge or reinforce existing gender-based power dynamics. So to conclude my review, I think what Wright offers in this book is not only how religious groups around the world have identified some sort of personified spirit figure as the primary cause of evil in the world, but a thorough and comprehensive analysis of how understanding the role of this evil figure evolved through the centuries, in part due to the influence of the worldviews of other cultures as expressed in the literature of these cultures. Wright clearly and excessively explains how these figures and their functions in the world help the people of a culture contend with the ideas of suffering, evil, and sin. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hannah. We appreciate your comments. Archie, would you like to respond? Join us on screen.
What if I said no? No, just kidding. Thank you, Anna and Hannah, for your Very good comments. Maybe I need to do a second edition with some of the things that you raised, some of the issues you raised in particular. On your point about the relationship of really examining, there's something I thought about when I was writing the book, was the relationship between the Satan figure in the Hebrew Bible and the Diabolos in the Septuagint. I think that issue also comes up in the New Testament as well. So that I think that's something that is a very good point to raise, that it's something I thought about when I was writing the book, but I just, at that point, I just wanted to keep moving. And that would have, this project took about 10 years, to be honest. So you can imagine there's times where I thought about adding other stuff that I just couldn't take the time. But I think that's a really good point. And I think when and if I was to do a revision of this, that's something that I think would probably add either as a excursus or something like that, because it seems that the comments that you made, it seems that there is some significance there to looking into that issue about, the Satan in the Hebrew Bible versus, how the Greeks understood that figure. Is there a direct translation or direct term in Greek that could be used for Satan? Because there seems to be, there's a slightly nuanced difference between the two and their definition. Sorry. And the definitions of the Hebrew term and the definition of the Greek term. There's a slight nuance there that could play an interesting part in understanding, how that was going about, particularly what you said about, the Septuagint being written around or translated around the same time as some of the Second Temple material. I think that's really going on into the New Testament as well. I think that's an important point, which I will look into and maybe write something on that. Thank you for that. Then your comment about the special status in the heavenly court. I hadn't really, I suppose I had in some way thought about that, just because his task seems to be highlighted in the Hebrew Bible Septuagint a lot more than some of the other sons of God that appear in the Divine Council. And I didn't really look at it as being a special status, but now that I think about it, you probably raised a very good point there, that his role is very significant versus some of the other B'nai Elohim in the heavenly court. Because, like, what your comment about, the sons of God were there and then Satan happened to show up, like you mentioned that he's not there perhaps all the time, where that would give him some kind of a significant. But I think one of the questions that kept coming to my mind when I was working on in that particular section in Job is there just one, and this is something that kind of runs through the book too, this question I keep kind of raising, is there only one Satan in the Jewish world of the Old Testament? And then even when we get into the Second Temple literature, it appears that there's more than one, particularly in 1 Enoch, it mentions that there's multiple Satans at work. So does that make him less of a special status? Maybe it's the function that is the special status rather than, but I guess Satan is that function. If you're looking at that figure performing that function, then it is a special function within the divine court, which really makes a lot of sense from what you say, because the job of testing humanity, whether or not they're going to be faithful to God or not, is a huge issue in the whole problem of evil and theodicy and so forth. So yeah, whether there is more than one, I don't think really matters to the special status that you mentioned. I think that's really important. It's something probably I need to examine a bit more. And that's an excellent point. I really appreciate it. And then you also mentioned the issue of demons, and I'll get to Hannah's comment about some of that too, which is really interesting. I think you said it was cutting in and out a little bit, but you said that demons can be servants of God also. And I think Jubilee certainly shows that when Mastema takes authority over 10%, the 10% that God allows him to keep, that they are now serving under him, who is serving under God. So in a way, they are serving as servants of God in the mission of Mastema, which I see as continuing to be like what we see Satan in Job, is to test and try the righteousness of an individual or the faithfulness of an individual. Maybe I probably didn't do enough on that, and that's something that Hannah raised also, which I'll get to that in a second. I didn't quite understand. I couldn't quite hear. Was probably part of the problem. The transformation status in Septuagint dealing with continuity and discontinuity. Maybe you come back and try to expand on that a little bit. And then I think you mentioned that why or asked why Diabolos is not a proper name. Like it is a function, which I think is similar to what we see with Satan. Whether it's exactly the same or not, that goes back to your first question about, how do we look at Satan? How should we look at Diabolos? Are they the same exact figure in the mind of the Greeks? Is Diabolos Satan? And I think you raise a good point that maybe there's some difference there, particularly in that world, the Hellenistic world that they're living in. And that perhaps what you also mentioned that the meanings of Satan may be not clear to whether it's the Greek translators or the Greek audience of the text, reading the text. Again, a very good point. And perhaps the translators are trying to come up with the best term that they could use with Diabolos to translate the Hebrew Satan. I think that's probably a very good point that you raised there. Like I said, I think maybe this needs a revision, this book, but and the foreign influences, you mentioned something about the development of self, but again, it was kind of, maybe it's cutting out on my end or whatever, but maybe if you could just come back with that a little bit and maybe we could talk a bit more about that. But anyway, let me move on to Hannah's review. And thank you again for this, really interesting. You raised some really good points. And the idea about the lack of work on the army of demons that are there in the world of Second Temple Judaism and pseudepigrapha, and of course the New Testament. There just wasn't room. I would have loved to have done that. In fact, I think before I started this book, I had started another book on the whole idea of evil spirits. Of course, my dissertation was on the origin of evil spirits, which doesn't really go into this question that you ask about, what about this army of demons? Who are they and what they do? And I had never, I shouldn't say never, but I hadn't thought about the examination of gender and female demons within this work as well. That's another really good issue that probably should come to light. Maybe it needs to be another book on, maybe there needs to be a book on demons like this, and bring in ideas that you have in your work in relation to this whole problem of evil and where the army of demons, what is their role in all of this? Are they operating under the rule of Satan, who is working under the authority of God? That's the big question. But then the idea of gender and female demons is really interesting. That now that I think about it, I wish I would have examined something about that. But I thank you both. It was really helpful comments. And maybe Anna, if you could just come back to those couple of points that I asked just to clarify them so that I understand what you were.
Yes, sure. Just quickly, I think my point was, if I understood your overall argument correctly, like you focus or like you identify one major shift with the early church fathers, and in the understanding and in the changing of the representation of Satan within what was before like a long sort of trajectory of continuity somehow. But I wonder if instead like there might have been like other previously smaller shifts. The book of Job being the first of them, because Satan in the book of Job is somehow different or like more spatial, I say, but also you somehow discuss that in the book. No, there are more Satan. I think the way Satan is depicted in the book of Job in the Hebrew Bible is already like shows already a first shift, and then perhaps with the Septuagint we have another shift, and perhaps the changes and the reconfiguration of the notion of demons in the writings of the Second Temple period like represent another discontinuity with the past notion of demonic, which so I would say perhaps the overall trajectory is more complex or has some more internal differences even before what the early church fathers did with Satan. But I understand like your rationale, which was of course like to not project back later representation. So I understand also after your presentation better what you wanted to do with this book. So yes, and for the foreign influence, for the Persian influence and Zoroastrianism, I think that might be true, but I think there is also there is much discussion in scholarship on how and when the idea of self emerged. And how much weight this acquires in Second Temple writing, in Dead Sea Scrolls, and in the end, the way we conceived the self has an impact on how we conceptualize the origin of evil. So where the evil comes from the inner or from outside. And so if also these things might be related, and maybe this might be the reason why suddenly all these figures to somehow represent evil are suddenly appear in the literature from this time. Not only because, well, yes, there is a dualistic view that comes from East, or from Persia, but maybe this view just was triggered by some also internal phenomenon.
Good. Both of those are really helpful. Yeah, I mean the idea of those, there are multiple shifts. I think you can relate that to your idea about the special status, maybe in Job, where we see all of a sudden, he's been raised up versus what we see as his function in Numbers, for instance, that maybe that is a shift of he's just this kind of figure that's operating in the background. All of a sudden he's got a prominent role in Job and becomes prominent in the Second Temple period, generally under other names, but still that figure of an antagonist or adversary is still there in the text. And I hadn't thought about the development of the self, but yeah, that's definitely a major part of the whole problem of evil and how that affects the human experience. How how does the evil affect ourself, our own being? And I think that's something I probably should need to look into and do a bit more on it. That again, that would have been really interesting in this part of this work, but yeah, I really appreciate both of your comments. They're excellent, and I thank you very much.
Great. Well, I think at this point, why don't we take a 5-minute stretch break, and then we will come back together. I've collected maybe 3 or 4 questions from the chat and from email. I'd like to pose those and then open up the conversation to other participants. So I have 9:51 my time, which is Central Time in America here. So let's meet at 9:56. Let's take a 5-minute break. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Excellent work, Archie. It sounds like you're going to have to produce a second edition.
Yeah, Anna and Hannah had some very good comments that, a couple of them I kind of thought about while I was writing it, and I thought, so that's another chapter but yeah, I mean, the idea of the whole issue of gender and demonic, I just didn't have room, I guess, to tackle the issue of demons and evil spirits. So that's another book.
Mm-hmm.
Looking at how evil spirits evolved through the Hebrew Bible and similar track. I think that would be another book, and the idea of the gender involved in that too is really important.
Mhm, mhm.
But Anna's comment on the difference between Satan and Diabolos, I hadn't really thought that through, and that's a really good, really interesting. I think it would probably bear some fruit as to how or why we get to what it happens in the Septuagint, how and why it happens in the New Testament as well, because I think I raised that in about one of the texts in the New Testament, why the author switches back and forth between Satana and Diabolos in the same book, maybe even in the same chapter. So it's an interesting issue. Are they the same or are they different? I think I even raised that question, but I don't remember for sure. I tell people, when I write a book, it's basically, I write the book, it's gone, I'm on to something else. And I try to forget it, but I guess you can't. So, but I think that the Diabolos Satan issue is something that's really interesting and important. And it's probably something I should have chased down, but I just didn't. Second edition.
Yeah.
I mean, both of you offered some really good comments that I think I would definitely incorporate if I was to write a second edition of this. So maybe there needs to be. It sounds like I need to write a book on evil spirits too.
Well, let us come back together formally. I have 3 questions, Archie. Would you like them all at once, or would you like them one at a time?
Probably one at a time.
One at a time. I'll start with my own question then. I found it really interesting when you started talking about the church fathers towards the end of the book. You really focused in on Satan as a function, a social function. These people were associated with Satan because of X, Y, or Z. You went through a couple of examples. However, your earlier references to stories didn't necessarily include those references, though. It was more about origins. I'm wondering if you found a point in your research when people started ascribing relationship to a Satan figure as a means of alienation or creating group dynamics, group boundaries between people. I think it's there in your work, woven throughout, but I found it interesting that towards the end, you become very specific about that association. So I'm wondering for our viewers about when that transition happens, or if that's always a part of the Satan tradition itself.
That's a great question. And I think my mind went to the scrolls and the figure of Beliar in particular, that if we can relate the two, Satan and Beliar, that's another question, of course, but it seems that term is used to set boundaries within a community, because the authors of some of the scroll texts are using Beliar to speak, I think, to speak of the temple and the priesthood that are there. So they're using that figure to set a boundary or put a boundary upon them as being evil, and using that term if that's what I'm understanding you're asking. And then trying to think if it's something in the New Testament as well. I think it seems to be being used more. Well, we have Gnostic stuff going on in the New Testament, of course, and maybe that the idea of Satan is being used there similarly that we see in the early church fathers and the apologists, that Satan is kind of being used as a distinction for that particular community because of the things that are going on there, the Gnostic ideas or the heresy that's going on in the particular churches. Maybe that Satan figure, Diabolos, is being used to set a boundary for that too. If I'm understanding what you're asking, I think that's what you're asking. But
Yeah.
I think there's a few examples. So I think when I got to the church fathers, it seemed to be the prominent feature that they were using this figure to set boundaries for the Gnostics and various other groups, and how that figure was being understood by them and how it was being understood by their church fathers and so forth. So there's certainly that figure is separating the two groups and their understanding of what Satan was in the early church fathers. But I think it probably, maybe I should have highlighted it some more in the earlier texts, but I think it's definitely there, particularly in this.
Yeah. We'll invite Tyler Stewart here to come on screen in a little while. He has some work about this in relation to Galatians. I see he just made a comment in the chat, so we'll invite him on screen here in a little while. Some of the other comments I've collected, Zaini Zevet asks this question: how much reliance may we have on Zoroastrian sources when most of the manuscripts are medieval?
Yeah, maybe Anna should answer that.
Yeah, we welcome your comments, Anna.
I mean, I got an answer, but go ahead. I'll let Anna speak to that.
Well, I should start by saying that I'm not overall a big fan of these foreign influence hypothesis, exactly for those reasons. But I think it remains, let's say, a fact that Persian influences are documented in the Hebrew Bible, at least on the level of language, and also perhaps the idea that Satan itself is somehow modeled after these overseers of the Achaemenid Empire. Like, I think it's plausible. So I think some influence is plausible, but I think it becomes effective when it encounters also like inner somehow reasons or inner factors, let us say. So yeah, this would be my stand on it. Also, another thing with someone with a real competence on these sources should perhaps try to document is really like how much and how many direct influences can be documented, because so far we remain in, well, these broad views, dualistic cosmological views. Well, everyone can easily agree, but then in the shaping of actual religious paradigms, I think things become more difficult.
Yeah.
Also on text, documenting textual influences, also things become, I think, less evident, in my opinion. But
I think that, we have to be very careful with the Zoroastrian stuff because of the late dating, but I think, the dualistic aspects that appear to come out of the Persian world are certainly influencing what's going on, and probably people would argue differently about that, but what's going on in Second Temple Judaism, but the dating of the text. But I think I talk about that in first chapter, where we do have to be careful about how we use these texts and the influence they've had on Israel and Judaism post-exilic. So yeah.
Yeah, very good. I'll pose one more question and then open it up to discussion. Liz Freed wrote, in 4 Esdras, the source of evil is God himself. And this is a very late book relative to other books that you have discussed here in your presentations. Do you have any thoughts about this?
Well, I mean, that idea is present in Hebrew Bible too. I think I mentioned a few texts where God is. I can't remember who. One of you two mentioned the calamity, or God is responsible. Maybe it was Amos that you drew from. So, yes, I don't know that it's such a far out thing that in 4th Esdras that God is responsible for evil, because we have there is precedent for it in Hebrew Bible, which maybe the author of that text is kind of drawing from, but I don't know what to make of it. I suppose, yeah, I don't. Maybe the other Anna and Hannah have something, or anyone else on the screen has something they can add to that. But I think there's precedent for it, so I'm not really sure. It doesn't surprise me that that's the case.
I think at this point, let's just open the conversation. Gabriele Boccaccini offered to be a discussant, just to offer his views and kind of reflect on this and the work in general. Ryan Stokes and Tyler Stewart, who are on screen, also have written about this concept of evil. And we would welcome your thoughts about these topics that we've covered today. So Gabriele, we'll start with you.
Yes, let's start the conversation. With the being of seminar, usually discussion is the most lively part of our events. So because we are talking of the devil, let me play the devil's advocate. I mean, it's very appropriate today. My first, I mean, I appreciate very much, I like your book very much, but I have some questions, some big questions. The first one I already wrote in the chat. I understand the theological perspective of your book. So you want to know what the Hebrew Bible says about the devil, but from the historical point of view, it doesn't make any sense, because there was no Hebrew Bible in Second Temple Judaism. And the distinction between Hebrew Bible and pseudepigrapha really is completely irrelevant from a historical point of view. Of course, you point out that there is a diversity of in Second Temple Judaism, so different groups have different ideas about the devil. And this is the kind of historical discussion that I would like to have. Second, I really think that your book makes some very good points. It reminds us that the dualism is not between God and the devil, because the devil is not another God. So, and in fact, usually the failure, Satan, is presented as the opposite of Michael, or the opposite of a Messiah. So the opposition is between entities that in any case are under the authority of the one God, who is the creator of all. So, and also you remind us that in Second Temple Judaism, we don't have groups that are completely abolishing free will, or see evil only as a consequence of the Satan. Okay, so free will and responsibility remains very, very important. And contrary to what Augustine will say, there is no idea that humans are made enabled to do good because of the devil. This is not an idea that is in any group of Second Temple Judaism. Nonetheless, there is a big difference between the Satan in Job and the Satan in Enoch. Okay, so, and of course, there is a big difference in saying, like Elizabeth made this point, in saying, like in For Ezra, that the evil inclination is from God, and instead of saying that the evil inclination comes from the devil. So there are huge differences. I mean, and I wonder, Archie, if the category that you use of Satan being autonomous or semi-autonomous is really the best category, or we should use more a category of whether the Satan is obedient or disobedient, is rebellious, or so, because I find this more appropriate, because of course in Job the Satan is obedient, and while instead the fallen angels are disobedient. So I agree with you that both of them are not autonomous properly, because they are creation of God, and in any case God remains the supreme God of and the only God of the universe. But nonetheless, the fact of being obedient or disobedient made a big difference. So I would say that we don't have so much a fluidity in terms of autonomy or semi-autonomy, but we have a fluidity in terms of obedience or disobedience. And in this sense, I think that there is a huge difference. So between, and Christianity, of course, is more in line with those who believe that the Satan of the fallen angels, of the spirits, are disobedient, rebellious, while instead in Rabbinic Judaism, of course, the emphasis will be more on the obedience, and so also God as a source of evil. So I would love to spend the entire morning talking about these things, but I want to just to stop here because I think that you raised some huge questions, and maybe, I mean, if your work works very well to counterbalance some excesses in the Christian interpretation of the Satan, I think that nonetheless we should not downplay the big difference that we have in different Jewish groups in the Second Temple period about the understanding of the figure of the Satan in terms of being obedient or disobedient.
Archie, if it's okay, we'll continue. We'll have some other conversation. Bob raised his hand. Bob, you want to chime in here?
Thank you. I didn't mean to jump ahead of Tyler and Ryan, but I had intended to ask Dr. Angelini about, why the authors of the Hebrew Bible had, brought about the figure of Satan and created him as such a unique, different individual. But I want to get back to what Gabriella just said too, and that maybe they can relate to each other, because Gabriella was discussing how they're the autonomous versus obedient, and he was classifying them as obedient. But I thought it was very significant that Satan is allowed to have to challenge God to take an oath to him, to where once that oath is taken, Satan has complete autonomy, it seems to me, to do whatever he wants with whatever individual has been given to him by God under that oath. I mean, that's at least a semi-autonomous thing that he can do, where there are no bounds at this point, it seems. Am I reading that wrong? And what would, getting back to that, what would bring the Hebrew author to explain that? Does this get back to the self that you were talking about? Is it a shift from guilt of Israel as a nation to shift of guilt of an individual? Is that why he comes into play?
Anyone want to respond?
Anna does, I can tell.
Archie, do you want to comment on that, or I?
Well, I'll say something briefly, kind of related to what Gabriella said about the autonomy and obedient. I think the autonomous language may be something that I'm kind of being anachronistic with from how the figure's understood in the church today, so to speak. But I think you're right, Gabriella, and about the obedient and disobedient. That's probably a better way to describe the activity. And I think I would not say that Satan in the book of Job has autonomy. He's still only working under the authority of God, and he's being obedient to what God allows him to do. And I think that's really a really important point. It's not that he can go off and do whatever he wants. He still has to be obedient to what God has told him. And I think I hadn't thought about that, Gabrielle, that language, the obedient and disobedient language, is much better than autonomy or semi-autonomous or rebellious, even bringing those into play. But I think Satan in Job definitely should be understood as being obedient rather than, I don't know if I say that in the section on Job that he's being autonomous. I don't think I do. I think that's something that comes later in the early church section, but I'm not, or maybe even in the New Testament. But I think that the obedience and disobedience terminology that's really good. I like that much better than what I was trying to say.
Yes, because could allow also to differentiate between different groups. Because I agree. I mean, in Job, Satan is obedient. I don't know if the same we can say about the tradition of Enoch.
Yeah.
Yeah, Tyler.
Yeah, I wonder. Thanks. Thank you for an excellent book, Archie. This is, your work has been really influential in my own thinking. So it was a pleasure to read this book and appreciate the careful work you've done here. So thank you. Along these lines of obedience and disobedience, I wonder how we have to think about the question of agency of superhuman figures in general. So, one of the questions I think that comes up is, if they have agency, then we can talk about obedience. But if they're simply sort of exercising, if they're sort of an extension of divine action as non-autonomous or non like what kind of agency do they have? And do you see a development? I mean, one of the things I was so fascinated by your book that you mentioned is that the role of Justin Martyr in kind of transforming notions about Satan tradition and patristic literature, that Justin is the first figure who really connects Genesis 3 to Satan in a substantial way, although you do have, some oblique things in Revelation 12 and Romans 16 that are kind of could be sources for what Justin's doing there. But one of the things that's so distinctive about what Justin does in his portrait of Satan is how he combines the Enochic material and applies the rebellion of the Watchers to characterize the character of the Satan figure. And so general thoughts that you have on thinking about agency of Satan, but also agency of angels in general in the Hebrew Bible, thinking angel of the Lord, these figures, are they able to do something other than what God wills?
Well, yeah, I think the fallen Watchers is a very good example that, yeah, they can go outside of the agency that they've been granted by God as divine beings or angels, if we want to use that term. But so I think they can. I think the evidence in the Book of Watchers tells us that even though their agency is supposed to be limited, I think they can go beyond the bounds of that in rebellious action. Or I think the idea of that, it's not just humans that have free will. That I think we're told that divine beings have free will as well, and therefore we see what the watcher angels do, and as they choose to follow their own desires rather than following after the agency that God has granted them to be overseers of humanity and civilization that we see in the Book of Jubilees, especially. So, but I think they can break those bonds of agency that they've been granted by God.
Welcome, Ryan. Do you have some thoughts about this? What are your reactions? You're still muted, Ryan.
There we go. I do that every time. First of all, thanks for organizing such an interesting panel, and Archie, thanks for writing such a stimulating book. I really enjoyed reading it and found myself thinking as I read it that I wish I had said some of the things that you said.
My picture was thinking the same thing too, so that's why I stole some of your ideas.
That's fine. That's fine. I haven't seen the check yet for that, but I'll look forward to it. Yeah, so many interesting ideas. The respondents made very good points as well. And the two things that have stood out to me about the conversation so far, one has to do with the transition from Satan to Diabolos. And my suspicion is that the translators of the Septuagint were trying to come up with some sort of equivalent for Satan. There wasn't a theological motivation necessarily, because we have some texts where we have Satan where it's not referring to the Satan, and they're still using cognates of Diabolos in those contexts. However, and this is based on my own research, and some of you may not agree with it. I do think that one door that the translation Diabolos opens is this notion of slander and accusation, which I don't see as much in the word Satan in the Hebrew Bible, but that certainly is that's within the semantic range of Diabolos. And so I think that does open the door, or perhaps facilitate the transition of Satan from someone who's harming others to someone who's also going before God and issuing accusations that these people are sinners or are would-be sinners. The other thing that I think question that I would like to speak to, I believe, is the use of the Satan and similar figures socially, particularly to characterize out-groups or those outside the community, to distinguish them from those within the community. And I think with this, as the Satan comes to accrue more roles and his role changes, that positions the belief or the idea of the Satan better to function in that capacity. When we have Satan who's primarily causing trouble for sinners, that's not someone who's as useful for characterizing outsiders as is Satan who's actually causing people to sin. And so once Satan is leading people to sin, then it makes sense to use this character to explain why people outside of your group differ from you in their practice, or why people outside of your group may even be trying to harm you, because you can blame their actions, their ideas, their conduct that differs from yours on a Satan figure. And so that's why we see this idea coming along perhaps more in the Book of Jubilees than we see in Zechariah or Job. We could say the same thing about why we don't get an explanation for why Satan exists. We don't really get an origin story for Satan until relatively late in this period. As long as Satan is serving God and doing what he's supposed to be doing, as long as he's obedient more so than he's disobedient, you don't really need to explain the existence of this figure. Once he's more of a rebel, causing trouble, trying to thwart God's plan, causing trouble for religious insiders, at that point, we need to explain where this person came from, because he's a little more problematic. Did God make this person? Where did this person go astray? And what is the reason for this person's agenda against us or against God? And so I think that some of the questions that we have about Satan can be explained as we trace the trajectory and the development of this idea, and as thinking about this figure changes, it opens up the way for other thinking about this figure to change. But thank you. Thanks for letting me participate, and thanks for such an engaging book.
Thanks, Ryan.
Yeah, Archie, what do you think? Yeah.
Yeah. I think you mentioned about the slander concept with the Diabolus and Satan in Job in particular. I mean, it would depend how you want to read that, because I think Satan actually slanders Job by saying, he'll just turn away from you as soon as you take all this stuff away from him. So in essence, that's kind of slander. But again, that's semantics there, how we want to, I think you're right. And Anna pointed that out in her comments about the difference between the two terms that needs to be investigated, and how the Greeks understood diabolos. Is it the same way that that the Hebrews understood Satan? Maybe, maybe not, but I think it's something that's worthy of exploration. And then your idea about the origin story, I think when we get to the early church fathers, we start to see that kind of come to blossom. You get these groups that the early church leadership is in opposition to. They're coming up with these stories of the second god, which is the demiurge, which is the Satan, the devil, whoever. So I think we're getting some of that origin story when we get post New Testament, so to speak, if we can say that. I think maybe we get some of that origin there, but it's not all that clear. It's probably something else that needs to be investigated further. I don't know that if anyone's actually, maybe Henry has written on the origins of the Satan issue itself, but I think that there is some hints of it there in the early writings of the early church, but it's not, you don't get a story in the so-called canonical or extra biblical texts of the Second Temple period or the New Testament. You don't really get that origin story there, and that's a really important point. Why or how did he become so prominent? And we don't really know where he came from till we get to the writings of the early church and the heretics, so to speak.
Archie, if I may, I think that I agree with you that the point of Ryan is very well made. I mean, that the problem of rebellion makes people ask the origin of Satan. I mean, as long as obedient is an angel, okay, and does in his own way what God wants him to do. But when some traditions, of course, not everybody, but some tradition began emphasizing this figure as a rebellious figure, and then, of course, the problem came about the origin, because the two things, of course, are very closely related.
Yeah, when we go to the rebellious. Sorry, I didn't mean to butt in, but we get to the rebellious issue of Satan. That I kind of try to talk about that in the section on Revelation or John's Apocalypse, and the whole chronological issue that's going on there between the fall of Satan and whether it was before Adam came on the scene, and how does all that work when you get to Revelation 12? How is all that working? How's that battle of Michael, and where's Jesus and all of that? And he seems to be on the earth when that's going on in heaven, and then you see Satan has fallen to earth before humanity showed up, and so forth. So the rebellion of Satan is really something that's really not very clear when that actually takes place, whether we're talking about a biblical text or an extra biblical text. Maybe please jump in if you've got comments on clarifying that, but it's hard to say when he becomes this rebellious figure because of we see it clearly in Revelation that he's somehow become rebellious. If we understand he's the great dragon, the red dragon, the great serpent, and so forth, we see him being rebellious there. But when did that happen? Because the chronology of that story in Revelation is not clear at all.
Andy was raising his hand. Andy, do you want to chime in?
Can you unmute him?
There you are.
Go ahead.
Am I here?
We can hear you. Yep.
Yeah. Archie, your presentation seems to sort of fit into my system of the original biography of Satan, as I call it, where he is God's agent, and he's just one person after he's identified as one person in the Septuagint with Ho Diabolos, which indicates that's a proper name, where the article in the Hebrew indicates it's a common name. But and then what I call the new biography of Satan begins with the fathers, and you indicated at the end that you bring up the Gnostics and think that it might be in opposition to the Gnostics that they've come up with this. And I rather agree with Anna. I think it is that that this is a homegrown sort of thing. You don't need external influences, and I think the fathers are just trying to figure out what's there in the Old Testament, and I think that Justin is a crucial person here. He's the first person to. He thinks that the Satan is an angel named Serpent in Psalm 82, and I just sent you my stuff on this a little while ago. He thinks that the reason that Satan is the serpent and is the serpent in the Garden of Eden, I think he is the first person to identify the serpent in the Garden of Eden with Satan. And the reason he does so is because he does a folk etymology number on Satanas. He thinks that is Jesus, and Jesus calls him Sata Nahash, actually. That is apostate serpent. And that is why we get it from the mouth of Jesus himself, that he is the serpent there. And he applies the Isaiah 14 to Satan after he commits his sin of deceiving Adam and Eve, and he can't get back into heaven. So that's just natural. There's no reason to look at, say, Zoroastrian influences and so forth. And the first step to the idea of the rebellion of Satan is the one that you find in the life of Adam, which is that Satan was the angel that resented Adam being created in the form of God, and he refuses to worship that image of God in Adam, and he's thrown out of heaven, and therefore he ruins Adam and Eve out of resentment, and he becomes an enemy of God there. That's the intermediate point. But the most important addition to this was Origen, who is the first person to portray Satan as sinning before creation of man, and he does so by applying that the verse of Isaiah 14 to Satan and has him sinning out of pride. And therefore, he becomes an enemy of God at that point. Those are the two, I think, important events. Justin identifying the serpent as Satan, and Origen identifying Satan as an enemy of God from the beginning. So in the first case, Satan's fall is caused by Adam. And in the second case, he sins by himself out of pride and then comes down and becomes an enemy of God and destroys Adam and Eve. So that's what I call the new biography.
Thank you, Andy. Bob, do you have a comment on this strain? If not, Gabriele had responded in the chat. We can call on him.
Gabriella, I wasn't going to talk about this strand. I was going to go to a different strand.
All right, if you don't mind, hold your comment. Gabriele, did you want to respond?
No, I simply want to say that we have already these elements in the tradition of Enoch. Because in the parables of Enoch, the serpent is already identified with an angel, one of the fallen angels. So this is before these Christian authors. And the idea of rebellious angels is already in the book of the Watchers. Of course, we don't have, these are not called Satan, but characters like Shemiaz or Azazel are have many elements in common with the figure of the devil. There is the reference in the animal apocalypse to the star that fell down even before Adam. So I'm a little bit reticent to say that this is simply something that Christian authors have produced, because it's already elements that are present in Jewish apocalyptic texts, especially in the tradition of Enoch, where all these elements were already present. The elements of rebellion, the idea of the connection between the sin of Adam and the sin of the fallen angels. I mean, Stuart has just recently written a book on Paul, where he makes the strong point about that the idea of Paul derives largely from Enochic tradition. So, okay, if we consider only the Bible, yes, but the Bible is part of Jewish scriptures and of the Jewish tradition of Second Temple Judaism.
If I just add something, also there is the Book of Wisdom. This passage whose interpretation is not very clear, but in chapter 2 it is said that the devil brought the dead into the world, and it might refer already to Genesis 3 and point to this identification.
Yeah, my point is essentially the book of Revelation and Paul are depending a lot on Enochic traditions, apocalyptic tradition that predates them. I mean, after all, even in Revelation, we have the presentation of the devil as the serpent. And so this is not something that they invented. This was something that was already around. I mean, because the parables of Enoch is very clear on this.
Andy would like to respond. Andy, could you unmute again?
Yes, I don't see the identification of Satan with the serpent in the Book of Enoch, or I don't see Satan or anyone deceiving Adam and Eve in the Book of Enoch. Where is that?
It's in the parables of Enoch. It's not Satan, it's one of the fallen angels. It's one of the fallen angels.
Satan's in the similitudes of Enoch. They're the punishers. They're the punishers in the of the sinful people. I don't see any connection with Adam and Eve in the book of Enoch.
I can give you the passage.
There is a passage that it looks like an interpolation. The angel Gadriel, the angel Gadriel comes and
Exactly.
tempts Adam and Eve.
Yes.
On the if I may go to the thing that Anna brought up, in the book of wisdom, where it says that a diabolos, the envy of a diabolos, brought death into the world. I don't see how this can be identified with either the serpent or Satan as the serpent, because the author of the book of wisdom in chapter 10 considers the sin of Adam to be a mere misdemeanor. It was easily overcome, and it's not the sort of thing that would bring a death sentence upon Adam and the whole of humanity. And he goes on to say that it was Cain. He contrasts Adam with Cain, and Cain is the one that brought the first physical death into the world, and he was envious. So it looks like, and the first interpretation of that, which Archie brings up, is the first epistle of Clement, who does definitely identify that diabolos with Cain. So you don't have an identification of the serpent with Satan there, nor do you have it, I think, in Revelation 12, where you have the gigantic dragon, which is a dragon is a serpent, by the way, and the serpent there, it seems to me, is not the garden serpent of Eden, but it is the serpent of Isaiah 27, the great Leviathan, the sea serpent. So I think that does away with the New Testament passages identifying Satan with these the serpent in the Garden of Eden.
Archie, do you want to respond before we turn to Bob, maybe?
Yeah, I just want to say something about Gabriella's comment in the parables about the serpent being a fallen angel, and I find that really interesting because I'm wondering if, because there's several early church fathers, I'm trying to remember if Justin was one of them, that try to connect the Satan figure with the rebellious watchers in the watcher tradition. Although we know that name's not there, but I'm wondering if that's that connection is of them reading the Watchers, perhaps the Book of Watchers, which obviously they were. I'm wondering if they're understanding that serpent, taking that serpent, connecting then to the Satan figure, and then connecting that then to the fallen Watcher tradition. I wonder if that's because several of them mentioned that Satan was part of that Watcher tradition in 1 Enoch. So I'm wondering if that's a really good point that you raise about the serpent being one of the fallen angels. I'm wondering if that's part of why the early church fathers then brought the Satan figure into the Watcher tradition. It's really interesting.
Bob, you've had patiently have been waiting with your hand up. You wanted to take us in a new direction. Do you have some comments?
Yes, I wanted to bring up a point that Archie made at times in the book in his analysis of the figures in the text. And that was that there are times where one cannot determine if the Satan or Diabolus is referring to an individual human, or if it's referring to, or even maybe not an individual, maybe a government or a nation that's earthly, or whether it's referring to a supernatural figure. And in the blurring of that distinction, did this perhaps serve to feed the idea that a Satan, as a supernatural figure, could operate with complete autonomy outside of, any notion of being obedient to God. If they're working in conjunction with a human, manipulating a human, and the human has free will, is this then imparting a sense of free will to a supernatural being to not have to be obedient to God? Just a thought.
Yeah, I guess I'll make a comment here. I think, I think I mentioned that there's multiple occasions where Satan is used as a human. David is called a Satan, so I think I'm not sure how we can connect the superhuman being to these human figures just because they're being called an adversary. I think it probably was more of a common term than that was used. I mean, even when we get to the Gospels, when Jesus tells Peter, get you behind me, Satan, he's not calling him the Satan figure. He's calling him an adversary. And I was thinking about it this morning, like, get behind me means fall in behind me, because if you're going to be with me, you're going to be following me. And I think that's kind of what he's not calling. I don't think he's suggesting that Peter at that point is being influenced by Satan or the Satan, or he's being possessed by Satan to say these things that, no, Lord, you can't do that. I think Jesus is just telling him, look, you're being an idiot. Stop being an adversary to God's plan and get behind me and follow me, because we're going that way. So I don't know if I answered your question, but I think that, I don't know if the term, I think, was probably more common being used as an adversary than we'd like to imagine. So
Thank you.
Good. I think at this point, why don't we start to bring our event to a close? Archie, I'd like to give you a couple of minutes if you'd like to offer us some closing words, and then I will again formally thank all of our reviewers and participants from today. I'll turn it over to you, Archie.
thank you. Well, I want to thank everybody who was involved in this, of course, especially Gabrielle and Joshua in the Enoch seminar, and all of your, especially want to thank Anna and Hannah for their comments, and definitely will take them to heart should a second edition of this book become something. But I'm also going to look into their issues they raised and maybe write something on, in particular, the Satan and Diabolos, and then the issue of the demons and the gender issue that Hannah raised. And then all of the comments of those of you who came on the screen, in particular, one that Andy's been working with Satan a lot longer than I have. So he's the one who can write a biography on him, I guess. So, but again, like what I said earlier on, I hope that the people who read this book, I hope that, they'll think about the larger evil that goes on in our world, and that, this Satan figure in biblical and extra biblical texts is just, an example of the evil in our world. And, what can we do to try to resolve these issues if we can, just as mere human beings. We don't need to be supernatural heavenly beings to try to solve the problems that we face in our world, and try to help eliminate some of the problem of evil. So thank you all. I very much appreciate your comments and time that you took out to be a part of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Archie, for your contribution in your book. And thank you, Anna and Hannah, for your excellent reviews. This was a wonderful conversation. Yes, please, everyone, join me in giving the Zoom round of applause to our presenters. Thank you. Our next reviews of the Enoch seminar event will be on July 12th, where we are reviewing Reuben Booner's book, Messianic High Christology. And so we hope that you'll be able to join us for that event. Please stay connected to RES through the website and the Facebook page. Thank you, everyone, for a great conversation. We'll bid you well for today. Yeah, Gabrielle.
I would like also to remember that beside the meetings of the review or book reviews, we have now an event on March 14 on John within Judaism, and so a seminar, a one-day seminar on this issue on John within Judaism, and also on March 14th, and also on the within Judaism perspective in the study of the New Testament. So will be a panel among different specialists that are studying text in the New Testament within Judaism. So we invite all of you to join us. And again, to repeat what Joshua said at the beginning, the invitation to become members of the Enoch seminar, you find on our website all information. We are a big, small organization that lives and prospers because of the support of our members, and we want to continue to offer free this event based on the support of our members. Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a great day.